And hello everyone, and welcome to a new episode of Coffee with Thorben. Hope you grabbed your cup of coffee or tea or whatever you prefer. Let me quickly change that here. I'm hearing myself. Okay, now it's better. Yeah, so again, welcome to this week's episode of Coffee with Thorben. Today with my mug from, I don't know if you see that, GeekCon 2017. Was a great conference, back in the days where we traveled to the same location and then actually met in person to discuss stuff like these things that we are talking about now, or doing other conference talks and stuff. But yeah, I hope that we'll be able to do that again in the near future. So yeah, for today, I've picked a few questions from my blog. And if you have any questions about JP or Hibernate, feel free to ask them here in the chat. And then I'm more than happy to answer these as well. So until you posted a few questions, I will just work on the comments that I have to answer anyways in the blog. So let's take a look at this one. So Tarek says that a better solution would be to do this. Hi Sandeep. What on the last? So what is this article about? Let me quickly check. Yes, it's about the handling of null values when ordering the result of a criteria query. Yeah. So what I suggested to do here is to use Coalesce, which is a function that returns the first element that is not null. So if the publishing date of the book record isn't null, then we get that one. And if it's null, then we get the local date that we defined as max date. Or you could also use min date, depending if you want to have empty dates first or last. So what does Tarek suggest? So he says you could do a select case when would get. Otherwise, and then he wants to do an order by null last. That looks like does that trigger an additional query? No, probably not. No. So yeah, then sure, you can do the same, or you can do this. You can, well, what he's basically suggesting is you take a look at the attribute by which you want to order, and if it's null, then this expression returns 1. If it's not null, then it returns 0. And if you then include the null last as the first element in your, or the first criterion in your order by expression, then you will get all the null elements first. Yeah, sure. Thanks for your suggestion. Use that approach as well. So yeah, is it better than the other one? To be honest, I'm not exactly sure. In the end, they will produce the same result. We would need to run an explain analyze on the database and probably do some performance tests to find out which expression is more expensive. But yeah, I don't expect any performance issues from that expression, so that would be fine. So yeah, post comment. So yeah, you can either check if the element is null and then return 1 or 0, and then order by the date, or as I suggested here, you use the coalesce function to get the first element that is not null. Let me take another look at the chat. Yeah, you can also do something like that. That's also fine. Okay, let's take another look at commenting on the blog. So this article is about how to use a subquery in a criteria query. So creating a subquery is pretty similar to creating a normal criteria query. Just call the subquery method instead of the create query method on the criteria query, not on the criteria builder. And then yeah, you have an almost identical API to build up that subquery. So what was the question here? Where did book underscore authors come from? Oh yeah, that's a good question. So book underscore authors is so book underscore is part of the is part of the JPA meta model. I prepared an example here. So we have a simple author entity class here. You see nothing interesting here, just a primary key column, a few basic attributes. And the author underscore class that you can see here is located in the same package as the entity class here. Org thoughts on Java model with the package. It has the same name as the entity class plus an additional underscore at the end. And then you have a set of attributes, of static attributes. Each of them describes one attribute of the entity. And the great thing about that is that you can use it in your criteria queries to define entity graphs, or in more or less all other places where JPA defines an API to do something based on your entities. And you can use it to reference certain attributes. We will have a look at an example in the article, but before we go there, let me quickly explain how to get these classes. It's very simple. The JPA spec defines that you need that each persistence provider needs to provide generator implementation for these meta model classes, and with Hibernate the only thing you need to do is to add a dependency to Hibernate JPA model again, and that's all. So yeah, let's switch back to the browser, and I used it here with book underscore. So yeah, as you can see, I define a subquery here. Start by creating the subquery, then defining the from clause, and then defining a join from the root element to, which is a book, to its authors, and I use the book underscore class to reference the attribute with name authors that maps the association, and do the same here to reference the ID attribute, and there to reference the ID attribute with the author, and so on. And the great benefit is, if we go back to the IDE, that these attributes have quite a few type information. So here you can see that attribute is defined on the author entity, and it's of type string. And the books attribute is of type book, and it's not a singular attribute, it's a list attribute. And these information can be used by the JPA APIs to provide additional type safety, to provide additional checks. And the next benefit is, if you change your entity and run your build, then the generator will create new meta model classes. And due to that, this class here will change. And if you change first name to, I don't know, first, then the first name attribute will no longer exist in the author underscore class, and all the places in your code where you reference that attribute will create a compiler error because the attribute no longer exists. Sure, that's not the best tooling in place if you're doing some refactoring, but it's way better than searching for the string first name in your whole code base and then hope that you found all of them and replaced them. So this at least brings a compiler error and clearly shows that something needs to be fixed there. Okay, let's get back to the block. Let me quickly answer that, and then I would take a look at my noise question. Okay, where did book authors come from? The book author class is a generated class that's part of JPA's meta model. You can use it to reference attributes in a type safe way when implementing a criteria query or an entity graph. You can learn more about it here. And now I have to quickly take a look at my spreadsheet with all my articles and find it there. I'm sure I have an article about it. Meta model. There it is. Okay, so if you want to dive deeper into the meta model topic, go to thoughtsonjava.org/static-meta-model, and here you can then see how it works, how to use it, and so on. Okay, but there was a question in the chat and I promised to answer it. So Mano asked, hi, which approach is better, using auto-increment or using sequences as primary key for tables in MariaDB 10.3? I'm facing issues if insert ignore is failing on tables, getting gaps in primary key. Okay, so there are multiple things we need to talk about here. First of all, in general, the sequence strategy is better with is the faster approach if you're using Hibernate. The main reason for that is that Hibernate can separate the insert operation from the from creating and getting the primary key value, because with the database sequence, Hibernate can send a statement to this database to get the next value from the sequence, and it provides several algorithms to optimize that approach so that it doesn't have to do that for each and every new entity. So that enables Hibernate to first get the primary key value, then do whatever it needs to do, and at the end of the transaction or whenever it has to flush, Hibernate can then perform the insert statement. That enables you to use JDBC batching efficiently, that can provide you additional performance benefits due to the right behind optimization that Hibernate provides. And yeah, there are several things that can provide you with a better performance. With an auto-incremented database column, on the other hand, which is with Hibernate the generation type identity, there you have the issue that the primary key value gets generated when you insert the record into the database table. The database sends the new primary key value back as a response to the insert statement. And due to that, Hibernate has to immediately execute the insert statement when you call the persist method for a new entity object. And that's because Hibernate needs the primary key value internally to manage the actual entity. And in the end, that makes the identity strategy still a good approach to generate primary key values, but it's not as efficient as a database sequence. So now we have the issue that not all databases support sequences. I'm not 100% sure if MariaDB supports sequences. If it does, then please use a sequence to generate the primary key value. If not, then yeah, auto increment column is the best approach that you have. So now I'm not exactly sure what you mean with you're facing issues if insert ignore is failing on tables. But you wrote that you're getting gaps in primary keys, and yeah, that's something that can happen. You get gaps in primary keys if a transaction fails. You also get gaps in primary keys if you remove a record. Due to the additional performance optimizations that Hibernate provides for database sequences, you can also get gaps in your primary key values, or if you have a horizontally scaled application, you can also you can no longer be sure that the records get inserted one after the other, and that you have a clear sequence of your primary key values. So there you might have gaps, and the primary key values don't provide you the can't use the primary key values to order the records in the order in which they were inserted. But that's totally fine, because that's not the task of a primary key value. The primary key value identifies the database record, and that's its only job. So yeah, with each and every approach that you're using, you will have gaps in your primary keys. The only way to avoid that would be to implement your own algorithm to get the primary key value and to always lock the complete database table whenever you want to insert a new record. But that's a horrible idea, because your application will not be scalable. Everything has to wait if just there's one use case that wants to insert a record into that database table. So yeah, you just have to live with the situation that you have gaps in your primary keys. No way around it. Zahi wrote, "Hi Thorben, can you please explain how to decide which one is the owning entity in bidirectional many-to-many or bidirectional many-to-one association?" Yes. So for bidirectional many-to-one association, it's the entity that maps the foreign key column. So if you model a many-to-one association on the database level, then you have one table that contains the foreign key column, and that's the table that represents the many side. And when you then define your entities and map this association, then the many side of your bidirectional many-to-one association is the owning side, which defines the name of the foreign key column and which gets referenced by the other entity. For bidirectional many-to-many association, it actually doesn't matter which entity becomes the owning one. You can just pick one, because the many-to-many association gets mapped by an association table. For example, if you have books and authors, a book was written by multiple authors, one author might write more than a book. So there we have a typical many-to-many association, and between these tables we would have the books authors or authors books table, which contains references to both tables and represents the many-to-many association. So because the association is mapped by an additional association table, it doesn't matter where you define your association mapping and which entity becomes the owning side. So yeah, to sum it up, for bidirectional many-to-one association, the entity that represents the many side is always the owning side of the association. For bidirectional many to many, you can just pick one, it doesn't matter. Okay. Then Hopcroft. Hello Torben. Hi. In general situation, I use underscore for table naming, and in case I must use meta tag table in entity is normal practice. Table user metadata and table name. Okay. Yeah. Yeah, you can change the. Yeah, there are two things you can do. You can either use the table annotation that you described here in the chat to define the specific table name, to explicitly define which to explicitly define the name of the database table. Or what you could do is you could take a look at Hibernate's naming strategies. If you search in Google for Hibernate naming strategies, you should find an article that I've wrote a few weeks ago, definitely this year, about that topic, and there you can see how to change these kind of things so that you can adjust the naming as you need it. Stefan Meyer wrote, I have a more architectural question. We build now a flexible filtering framework in an agile project, what means it will be enhanced over time. Would you use JPQL, the query builder, or something else? Yeah, that depends. Because you're already writing about JPQL in the query builder, which would be the criteria API. I expect that you already have a JPA and Hibernate based domain model. So in that case, I would most likely use the query builder. If you think that your queries might get really complex, or maybe you don't have JPA entities in place, then you could also take a look at a framework called Juke. Can find it at juke.org. It's an interesting Java DSL that you can also integrate with Hibernate or use standalone, and that enables you to write the SQL statement in your Java code. The great thing about it is the code that, well, the Java DSL basically looks like SQL code. So if you understand SQL and if you can write an SQL statement, you can use this API in your Java code. And it provides good type safety, handles the pitfalls of the JDBC specification and all these kind of things. So yeah, if you need a more powerful and flexible API to create an SQL query, I would use Juke. If you already have a JPA domain model in place, you think that the capabilities of the criteria API are good enough, then I would use the criteria API. In this case, I wouldn't use the JPQA query, because to me it sounds like you need to be able to dynamically extend an existing query. And in a JPQA query, that would mean you need to concatenate strings to create the final statement. And in general, that's a pretty error-prone approach. So the criteria API or Juke provide a much better solution for that. Then Phil wrote, I have an abstract parent class that has inheritance strategy equals to joined. Is it possible to put a unique constraint on a child class entity that has a reference to a field in the parent? Problem is that in the data model, the parent field doesn't appear on the child table. Okay, for example, name is defined on parent and some type on child. I don't want two records with both same name and some type. No, I think you can't do that. Um, at least wouldn't know how to do it because um, constraints are normally on the same database table. And with the joint inheritance mapping, you split your or you distribute your inheritance hierarchy over multiple tables. So there you have a table that gets mapped by the superclass and contains all the columns defined by that superclass or mapped by that superclass, and then you have a table for each subclass that only contains the specific columns that are mapped by that subclass. So whenever you need to read a specific entity, Hibernate has to join the table that represents the parent class with the table that represents the child class. And it has to join that in a query. That's why it calls joined. And that means that if you have a column on the parent table and a column on the child table, or a subclass specific attribute and one that's part of the superclass, then they are mapped to columns in two different tables. And as far as I know, you can't define a constraint over two columns that are part of two different database tables. What you could try is you could implement you could implement a custom Java-based validation on your domain model. For example, by using bean validation. If you search for bean validation at Hibernate, you will find an article in which I show you how to use bean validation together with Hibernate. It works really well, and bean validation enables you to define your own validation rules, which get automatically checked before, for example, an entity gets persisted or updated. And you could use this approach to make sure that there's not one entity that set the same value on both attributes, on the attribute that's part of the parent class and of the child class. What you couldn't prevent there is that there are two different records that have the same value in two different columns. Yeah, the only thing you could do there is to implement a database trigger that actually performs a search. So database query, and that isn't a great idea. Yeah. No, Phil, I'm sorry, I need to disappoint you there. So the only thing that Hibernate can do is Hibernate can trigger the bean validation checks, but these are checked on that specific object. So yeah, you can use it to avoid storing the same value within the same in two attributes of that same entity object, but you can't prevent that the same values are set on two different objects. Okay, what else do we have? Yeah, Stefan, thanks for the kind words. Really appreciate it. John Sputnik could have a type column on the parent. Wouldn't discriminator column help in this case? Oh, Jens Schauder has a great idea in the chat. He suggests to create a materialized view that automatically updates whenever you write a record, and then put a constraint on that. That sounds interesting. But I have two questions there. Can you really make sure that this updates happens within the same transactional context so that we can roll back the transaction? And can I create a constraint over multiple columns within that view? I'm not sure there. I would say most databases don't support that. Maybe you can use some dark Oracle magic to implement that. I don't know. But I would say most databases might struggle with that. But I like the idea of the materialized view. Yeah, if you can achieve something, then it's probably using the approach that Jens described there. So yeah, if Phil, if you want to dive deeper into that, then I would follow that lead and give it a try and see how far you can get with that. If you come up with a result, please send me a message. I would love to know how you solved it. So Jonathan asked if the discriminator column wouldn't help in such case. So no, the discriminator column only tells, well, it's used in a single table inheritance mapping, and it tells Hibernate to which subclass the record in that table belongs. The issue there is that we are merging all records in all entity classes into one database table. So Hibernate needs an additional column in that table that tells them, okay, this record is actually, I don't know, a book object, and the other one is a blog post or something like that. Okay, so Jens just wrote that he used that approach in the past on an Oracle database. So yeah, Phil, give it a try. If Jens says that he used that approach in the past, then that sounds like a good idea, and I don't have any other suggestions on how to implement that right now. That's something that we need to handle on the database level, and it's probably something that will require some proprietary features. Yeah. Yamos, thanks so much. Thank you, Yamos, for the kind words. And then Jonathan wrote, we are using discriminator column in a joint table. That's why I was confused. For what do you actually use the discriminator column in a joint table inheritance mapping? So right now I would say, well, that's probably not needed for anything. Hibernate can probably handle the whole inheritance mapping without the discriminator column. But if you have an example, we can take a look at that. And then I can dive a little bit deeper into that topic. You use it specifically for these types of situations. Okay, yeah, but still, the discriminator column wouldn't contain the value in that in the column on the subtable. So yeah, maybe you can create a solution based on that, but right now I wouldn't know how to. Okay, let's take another look at questions. Okay, here I answered that comment. Let's take a look at this one. What's this article about? How to use the builder pattern. Yeah. So the general idea of this article was to not use an API like this to create your entities, but to be able to do something like this here. So basically applying the typical builder pattern to the to entities so that you have a more comfortable way to instantiate graphs of entities. So there are a few things you need to do for that. First of all, you need to implement all these builders. And then you need to do something else, and it looks like that, yeah, Bobby stumbled into that. Let me quickly check if I mentioned that somewhere here in the, do we have an example of the order entity? Order, no, no, only the builder classes. Okay. Okay, so I take a note to add an example to that. So so the issue that Bobby stumbled into here is that Hibernate didn't find a setter method for a specific attribute on the order entity. So what we would like to achieve with the builder is that we have a more expressive, probably fluent API that really makes our code easy to read and to use. And maybe we don't need a setter and getter methods for everything. And well, if you don't want to provide a setter and getter method for each attribute, then you need to annotate your primary key attribute with the ID annotation. Then Hibernate uses reflection to set and read the values of each attribute. If you want to dive deeper into that, then you can take a look at my access type articles where I explain that in great detail. But the main idea is if you annotate your ID or your primary key attribute with the add ID annotation, then you can do whatever you want with your getter and setter methods because Hibernate doesn't use them. And that means you can provide additional methods, you can remove setter methods that you don't want anyone to use for a generated primary key attribute, for example. And yeah, in general, design your API or the available methods of your entities as you want and as you seem meaningful and useful for that specific use case. Hi, Bobby. Don't. If you want to exclude some getter or setter methods, you need to annotate your primary key attribute with add ID. And it then uses reflection to set and get the values of all attributes. And you can implement or remove methods however you want. You have full flexibility to implement or remove getter and setter methods. I explained that in more detail now I need to take a look at my list of articles and then I will take another look at the chat and see if I can answer something there. So yeah, the whole thing here is called access strategies. And yeah, that basically tells Hibernate to either use getter and setter methods to work with entity attributes or to use reflection. And I in general recommend to annotate your primary key attribute with add ID so that you can then use, that Hibernate then uses reflection, which makes it way easier and more comfortable to use. Jenny asks, isn't it also possible to use Lombok for the builders? Yes and no. So yes, you can use Lombok with your entities. No, I think in most cases, Lombok isn't a good approach to creating or to implementing the builder pattern. Sure, you can create a builder class or you can generate a builder class for your entities. And technically speaking, this is a correct implementation of the builder pattern, sure. But the builder that you create should do more than just build the entity. It should provide an API that makes it easy to use, that provides that's semantically meaningful, that provides more value than just hiding the calls of a getter and setter methods. And that means you need to design an API that fits your model and the way these objects need to be used. And I think that's not possible with Lombok or any other approach that generates code. Yeah. So yes, technically you can use Lombok to implement the builder pattern, but I wouldn't recommend it. Okay, best practices for many-to-many associations. What's the best way to remove an author and the books associated with the author? You mind explaining? I'm pretty sure that I have an example for that somewhere here in the article. Oh yeah, there's an issue with the embedded YouTube video. Yeah, we will fix that over the next, I don't know, few days. Do a redesign of the site. You will still recognize it. It will look similar to what's now, what you see now, but there are a few things that I would like to prove and tweak. So we are changing up a few things internally, and you will also see rebranding of the site probably at the end of this week, maybe over the weekend, which with a new domain name and everything. But all the old links will still work, so we will keep the old domain as well. Just do a rebranding and then use my own name instead of Thoughts on Java. Yeah, here it is. Okay. So yeah, my recommendation to work with all bidirectional associations would be to implement utility methods like these here, add book, remove book, that ensure that you always update both ends of the association. Otherwise, your current persistence context will be inconsistent. And well, in worst case, if you have a bidirectional mapping and you update the reference, if you only update the referencing side of your association, then Hibernate will not update the association in the database. So please always make sure if you have a bidirectional association mapping that you provide these utility methods and that you make sure in your business code that you use these utility methods to actually update both ends of the association. Okay, here's an example of a utility method that removes an element from the... No, that was a different question. Best way to remove an author and the books associated with the author. Would you mind explaining? Yeah. Yeah. Okay, so the first thing here that you should not do is to use cascade type remove. Because if you are using cascade type remove on a many-to-many association, there are two things that can happen. First of all, if you remove author 1 and cascade that remove operation to the books, then Hibernate will remove all the books written by that author. And that includes all the books that this author wrote together with another author. So if you have a book that was written by author 1 and author 2, Hibernate will remove that book. But in most situations, you would want to keep that book because author 2 is still part of your system. And there's no need to remove that book as well, right? So yeah, that's the first pitfall for many-to-many associations and cascade type remove. And gets even worse if you cascade the remove operation on the author and on the book, because then the remove from the author gets cascaded to all books written by that author, and then it cascades this remove operation for each book back to all authors who have written that book, and for or if there's at least one book that was written by more than one author, then you cascaded the remove operation back to the authors, and you start then removing all books written by that second author, which you never touched in your business use case. So the remove operation keeps bouncing between these two entity classes until there are no associated book and author entities in your current application. So in the worst case, you're removing all author and book records, and that would obviously not be a good idea. So yeah, what's the answer to this question? The best way to an author with all associated books is to implement the operation manually or operation yourself. Need to get all books of that author, remove them, and then remove the book. No, remove the author. Please don't use cascade type remove, because it would also remove all books that this author put together with other authors. I explained that in great detail in this article. Cini asked, but other than many-to-many associations, wouldn't cascade be a better way rather than utility methods? Yeah, utility methods are only an option to remove an element from an association, not to actually delete it from the database. And cascade type, well, cascading in general should only be used for typical parent-child association. That's especially the case for remove operation. So an example would be an order with its order positions. The order position can't exist without an order. So if you are removing the order, then removing all of its position as a totally natural approach. Between the and that's, you don't have a parent-child association when you're working with a many-to-many association. In that case, in this case, for example, books can belong to other authors as well. The next issue that you have there is the book is a physical object that exists in the real world. So you need to be extra careful with cascading some remove operations, because just because you remove the book from your database doesn't mean that the book in your inventory disappears, right? So yeah, you need to have a few more validations there on the business level. But yeah, in general, you can use cascading for all typical parent-child operations. That's totally fine. Just keep in mind that Hibernate gets all the, so that Hibernate performs the cascading in memory. So that means Hibernate gets the associated entities from the database, maps them to entity objects, and then performs the lifecycle state change. That means Hibernate then, right, if you remove an order and cascade that operation to its positions, then Hibernate would get all position records from for that order from the database, then remove each position one by one with an SQL delete statement, and after that it would delete the order itself, which is okay if the order doesn't have hundreds or thousands of positions. It would be not a good idea to do that in a typical online bookstore example where a book can have a few thousand reviews. If you then use cascade type remove to delete the reviews when you delete the book, then you will probably run into performance issues. Milan asks, what's the difference between DAO and repository patterns? So in theory, there is a small but very important difference between the DAO and the repository pattern. And that is the level of abstraction that you apply with each pattern. So the DAO pattern performs insert, update, remove operations, stuff like this on a specific database record. The repository works on a higher abstraction level. So the repository pattern works on a logical level, and the operations that you perform in the repository can affect more than one database record. And the methods in your DAO might be more fine-grained than the methods in your repository, because the repository, as I said, works on this logical unit, while the DAO really works on a specific database, on the level of specific database record. That's the main difference between DAO and repository, at least in theory. In the real world, the DAO and the repository pattern, well, you quite often don't find a clean implementation of either of these. So if I join a project and one developer tells me about their implementation of a DAO pattern, and another co-worker of him tells me about their implementation of the repository pattern, then they are most likely talking about the same class or interface if you're using Spring Data JPA. So in real applications, quite often we have an implementation that is either called a DAO or repository pattern implementation, and it's actually stuck somewhere in between a DAO and a repository. And that's totally fine for most applications, because it enables you to put all your data store related code into one place and to provide an API that's hopefully easy to reuse, that provides some level of abstraction, and for almost all applications that's more than good enough. Yes, it's not a clean implementation in most cases of either of these patterns, but well, our job is to provide a maintainable and working application, not to provide the perfect implementation of a pattern, right? So yeah, the implementation that you normally find in the real world is more than good enough. But neither a clean DAO or a clean repository pattern implementation. Okay. Then let's take another look at a few questions on the blog. Yeah, some time ago I wrote an article about exposing JPA entities in your REST API. So the general idea there is that, or my general recommendation here is that you shouldn't expose your entities in your API, because it creates coupling between your API and your persistence layer, and the, well, in the end, the table structure in your database, and that's an implementation detail. You shouldn't expose that to the outside world. Having two different or separate implementations of your API classes and your entity classes also enables you to design your API and to provide a meaningful and useful API for each and every use case. So you have a huge advantage, which is the decoupling on the technical level, and you have an advantage on the let's say logical level, where you get the additional flexibility to adjust the API to your specific use case. So yeah, what are the questions here? To agree with the statement of okay. What about, Vladimir asks, what about domain layer? I mean, domain-driven design. Am I right that in this case you will end up with two mappings, one from entity to domain model and one from domain model to DTO? Well, in theory that might be the case, but in the real world I hope we avoid that, because I saw way too many applications that spent a good part of the execution time with mapping between different models and cleaning up all the useless objects that were created afterwards. So Jens, are you still there? So what would you answer here? I would say well, that probably breaks with domain-driven design principles in some way, but I would always recommend to model the to create database queries that return the just saw the answer by Jens. Yeah, so the question is, well, the one that you can see here on the screen by Vladimir. He asked about mapping between entities and domain model, and then from domain model to DTO objects for the API of a REST API. So I would always try to avoid that because I don't want to spend most of my time implementing some mapping code, or I don't want to spend my application to spend most of its time mapping between some data structures. That's just useless. So I would always recommend to try to create queries that provide you with the required DTO objects that you want to provide to your clients. Let me move chat over here. Okay. I would try to avoid that. As it would. Additional mappings between your models that requires additional code. Jens just wrote he would try to avoid DTOs. Yeah, that would probably be the result of this. Yeah, I would guess we are talking about the same solution. I thought, yeah, I would avoid the mapping from entity to domain model and would directly map to the DTO. But if we're implementing the DTO, well, if you're designing the DTO correctly, then the DTO would be identical to the class that we would use in our domain-driven design domain object. So yeah, we would reduce it to basically one mapping in the worst case. Okay, so Jens just wrote in the code in the chat that he would avoid the DTOs because he thinks that they might be a complete copy of the entity, or almost a complete copy. And yeah, in that case, it doesn't make a lot of sense to create this DTO object if you have another domain object, however that one looks. If you have a domain model, you can expose that to an API and try to get it directly in the database. However, I'm asking, where should we put conversion between DTOs and entity? What's the best practice? Should we put in service layer and then let controller do the rest, or should we let controller take everything and service just focus on entities and not DTOs? What's the best approach? I know I would always try to use jQuery with the constructor expression to Hibernate then maps the query result then this is the query result to instantiate a DTO object and avoids instantiating an entity object. This provides a much better performance. Yeah, so in general, if you are exposing DTOs at your API level, then try to try to use a query that gets these DTO objects directly from your database. Especially, well, at least if you are not implementing a write operation for which you use the entity object anyways. Because the instantiation and management of an entity object requires some overhead and is considerably slower than instantiating a DTO object which isn't managed by Hibernate. So if you can avoid the entity object altogether for read-only operations, of course, this is probably the best approach. Yeah, I agree with Jens' rule of thumb that he posted in the chat here. Never allow anything with JavaX persistence package or similar outside your persistence layer. Yeah, I like that approach. And that makes it much easier to implement your business logic because you're forced to work on a logical level. That means you can actually focus on the real business problem you're trying to solve and not on some technical database or JPA detail. And it ensures that you are creating a clean API for your services. So Jenny asked, how do you provide lists of enriched entities to the front end without a DTO? Well, if you provide an well, you're writing about an enriched. Okay, yeah. So yeah, if you're writing about enriched entities, then you're probably talking about a domain object or some kind of DTO class. We can call it however we want. From an architectural point of view, the important thing is it's not the entity that we are exposing. And as it seems, Jenny, you seem to agree with that based on your last comment here. So yeah, all your persistence classes should be part of the persistence layer and they should stay there. I mean, we are not. If we are implementing the backend of our application and the business logic there, then we don't want to see any UI classes in the API or in the data structure that we are consuming in some way, right? So why do we think it's okay to take our persistence-related classes, like the entities, and push them into the front end? I'm pretty sure the UI developer is as unhappy about that as we are if they get a persistence-related class. So yeah, better try to avoid that. Okay, so Jenny wrote that he uses domain classes of single object transfers and DTO for list views. Yeah, that's that's also okay. As I said, you can call these classes however you want. The important part for me is that it's not your entity and that it's a class that was designed for that specific use case or group of use cases. So we don't want to leak any implementation details to the client, and that includes the structure of our entities and the underlying database tables. And there's no reason to leak any information that we are using JPA or to leak any dependencies to that. DTOs mostly used in business layer, so it's a good idea to introduce them in the persistence layer, return a DTO from persistence layer method. Good question, Sini. Well, you could say you want a really clean design and you just keep the entities in your persistence layer, and then you have some kind of DTO or business class that you are using in the rest of your application. So Jens, yeah, we are talking about three types of classes, but in the end, it's actually only two. It's an entity class and it's some kind of class that was designed to represent the data in our use case, and that can be a domain object, that can be a DTO. Yeah, theoretically and from an architectural point of view, we can differentiate between them. I'm pretty sure if we have a discussion with a group of developers, then we quickly find out that we are actually all talking about the same thing. I called them DTOs. Some questions it was called a domain object. So yeah, I would say we are actually talking about two classes. And it's an artificial split that we introduce here between the domain object and the DTO. So let me get back to Sini's question, and then we wrap up the call afterwards. So he asked if we should keep the DTOs in the business layer or if we should return them from the persistence layer. So from a performance point of view, it makes sense to let Hibernate instantiate the DTO object for all read operations. If you search for Hibernate and entities versus DTOs, then you can find an article in which I did a few performance tests for read-only operations based on entities and DTOs, and DTOs were about 20-something% faster than entities, because you don't have all the management overhead. But you can also not use them for write operations. So it's something that that you always need to keep in mind. So yeah, DTOs faster for read operations. And that would be the reason why I would say, okay, I like to select them with the database query, and that Hibernate immediately instantiated. So Hibernate maps the SQL result set to constructor calls of that DTO class. And that's better than fetching entities and then mapping the DTOs yourself. From a performance point of view. I know that's something that you can discuss for hours with some architects, because they want to have a clean separation between them and mapping code that maps the entity to the DTO class. But in general, I would try to avoid that because you are running into issues. First of all, your entity projection is slower, and then the second one is you need the additional mapping code between the entity and the DTO. That's just annoying. Okay, Jenny wrote, I keep them separated in my mind and code because I build a FE object. What is an FE object? From an entity, and for DTO I use purpose-built SQLs. But it feels like we are talking a domain object. Okay. Yeah, it feels like we are more or less talking about the same thing. Do I have a code sample here? No, I don't. Okay, yeah, the general idea there would be to um, that you have a class that represents the required data that's not an entity, um, and that you can design it and adjust without needing to worry about table mappings, database table structures, stuff like that. Yeah, that would be the general idea here. Um, and then I don't mind if you call it DTO or domain object or whatever. Okay, yeah, Jenny seems to agree in general. Um, okay, so then I would say I wrap up this stream. Or does anyone have an urgent question that I should take a look at? Well, if not, then I'd like to thank you for your attention. My editor is currently working on a video for a YouTube video for this week. I hope we can publish it tomorrow. If not, then probably on Friday. And as I said, I'm working on a few redesign and rebranding things on the blog. So if you experience any issues over the weekend, especially Saturday and Sunday, then yeah, please try again later. Um, I hope that we will not have any hiccups, but you know how that is, how these kinds of things go, right? I mean, it's also only software. I will do my best to keep it as hiccup free as possible. And at the beginning of next week, you should be able to see the slightly adjusted design. I hope that I can keep almost everything as it is right now. There are just a few minor tweaks I would like to do. It's more a technical switch that we are working on. And yeah, the name of the site will change. Okay, then thanks a lot. Have a great rest of the day and rest of the week. Stay healthy and see you again next week. I already scheduled another live stream for next Wednesday, 2:30 p.m. Central European Summertime, so same time as today. Yeah, have a great day. Bye.